This is Deviance Lecture 3.2, and in this one we're going to talk about governmental deviance. Governmental deviance, that's what we're talking about. In this particular chapter, we are going to be talking more directly about politics, particularly the author's perception of the Trump administration. We'll talk about government corruption, as well as a phenomenon known as gaslighting, which you probably already know about. But first, let's talk about governmental Governmental deviance is deviant behavior that benefits the government or those in power. Governmental deviance can be difficult to study due to political divides. So, for example, deviance or criminality, when it's done by any president or really any high-standing figure in either the Democratic or Republican Party in the United States, given our political climate, is always highly controversial. We've seen this with document controversies and allegations in the Biden administration. We've seen this in the Trump administration. We saw this going back to accusations against Bill Clinton, and it goes back far and far and far before that, but let's focus on the modern era. Additionally, distrust of government is very common in the United States, and this can both help and harm our academic study of it. We are, as part of our national character, almost inherently distrusting of government, regardless of where we reside politically. Additional complexities in studying governmental deviance can occur because of an abundance of ambiguous and obscure laws. It's not really possible to know all of the laws, even though the common saying is ignorance of the law is not an excuse. Well, quite frankly, there's lots of laws you have no hope of ever knowing. Additionally, given the complex nature of government and a lack of information about how many government agencies operate, it can really cause a great deal of difficulty. Additionally, the greater complexity leads to greater confusion, and confusion leads to diminished awareness that the deviance is being committed. So we really have these factors coming together to create cycles of mistrust. However, this doesn't stop most sociologists, because we do tend to be troublemakers and not really afraid to question the status quo. Regardless of our politics, public officials and government officials abuse their power in a variety of ways. We see this with Democrats and Republicans. We have official deviance, which is an abuse of power by government officials or politicians running for office. We have political corruption, which is the abuse of power for personal gain, finance, or otherwise. We have election improprieties, which is the illegal or unethical means used to win elections. And we have official violence against citizens. These are things such as unjust imprisonment, neglect, etc. I would say that looking at all of these, each of these has at one time or another happened in the United States. We certainly are not the only ones who have done these things. There are absolutely countries that have done them far, far worse than the United States has, but there are also countries that have done it better than the United States has. I look at topics such as election improprieties, accusations of stealing or tampering in elections. That in particular is very, very hyper political. And from my observation and my experience with these things, those accusations of political election improprieties, vote rigging and stealing, etc., really are very, very overblown. They don't happen nearly as much as people say they are, and even the accusations themselves are very heavily politically weighted. It's more of a political tactic than it is something that people actually think is happening in a lot of cases. Hightower, in 2003, sociologist, contended that the United States has become what he calls a kleptocrat nation. This being a country ruled by white-collar thieves where money and power are consistently taken from the many to enrich the few. Obviously, this assertion has very strong roots in conflict theory, and Hightower claims that this is the result of what is commonly known as end-stage capitalism. The definition there being the assertion by many Marxian theorists that eventually capitalism will become so dysfunctional that it will collapse. If you want to read more about that, you can see our textbook on page 83. Now, the author of our texts asserts that many concepts surrounding governmental deviance can be applied to understanding the Trump administration. And while these assertions from an academic standpoint are somewhat valid, it is my perspective that we will not fully understand the Trump administration for some time. My guess is we won't have our clearest evidence until maybe 2030 at best. These concepts that the author levels against the Trump administration are known as the Matthew effect, the winners take all hypothesis, the Dunning-Kruger effect, and a phenomena commonly known as gaslighting. The Matthew effect is one way to accumulate great wealth, and in this tactic, we organize and exploit the talent of others. So in a criminal enterprise, in addition to the task of the leader is not necessarily to do anything more than to hide illegal activity. And obviously that's the illegal part. And this tactic is quite common in corporate America. Basically, the idea here being is that we gather up leaders that we know can do something for us, right? You get a bunch of henchmen, right? And you get a bunch of people and you figure out ways to use what they are good at to benefit yourself. Now, obviously, that's actually kind of a neutral sounding idea, right? You're just getting an inner circle of people who can go out and do things that they are highly skilled at and come back for you as the boss. This is not inherently a criminal thing to do, but it can be deployed in a criminal way. The winners take all hypothesis, which is posited by Garandis, is that ordinary citizens expect that elites will, or that the elites want to, change the world for the better of the non-elites. So we want to believe that the president wants to help the people in the United States. We want to believe that our leaders have our best interest in mind. And for a variety of reasons, regardless of the type of elite, elites often only seek their own self-betterment. And this was definitely a factor in Trump's campaign and public relations. I'm not denying that component of it. I'm just saying that it's hard to measure this kind of thing at this moment in time because we're not far away from enough politically. It still has to cool off for a couple years as far as I'm concerned. This assertion is directly tied to Marx's concepts of false consciousness and class consciousness. False consciousness being the belief that the boss and the workers have the same needs and desires, and then class consciousness being the realization that the bosses are actually exploiting workers and that workers have all the power and workers are actually being exploited. So from this standpoint then, we are in a condition of false consciousness, of not recognizing our reality. If we believe that the leaders are actually going to behave in our self-interest, and we become into a mode of class consciousness if we recognize basically that they're out to get us. It's a little bit of a paranoid set of ideas, but there certainly are certain very real social situations in which it could absolutely come into effect. The author asserts that the Dunning-Kruger effect also applies to the Trump administration. This being a situation in which an individual is so incompetent that they are incapable of realizing how actually flawed they are. These individuals may demand reward without reciprocation, so they might expect people to do things for them, even though they haven't done anything for the people. And this Dunning-Kruger effect can absolutely be found at multiple points in society. It's not just at the very top, and it's not just, again, the Trump administration that has been guilty of this Dunning-Kruger effect, but and I think of the accusations in our textbook, this is possibly the most immediately valid. I feel this is pretty much there as far as all these go. And then finally, our author accuses the Trump administration of repeatedly gaslighting the American public. This is an interesting thing to look at, especially if you look at public relations efforts between the Trump administration and the Obama administration, and then also the Trump administration and other presidential administrations. Gaslighting being a manipulative technique used by abusers and manipulative leaders. This is done slowly and systematically so that the target does not recognize they are being manipulated and has the eventual result of making the victims feel like they are going crazy. This was most obvious, most talked about and played up in the beginning of the Trump administration with the accusation that there are facts and then there are alternative facts, right? That was a very strange bit of political maneuvering that were attempted by Trump's first Secretary of State. The most classic or maybe famous example of this being the Trump administration and PR team were claiming that the Trump inauguration was better attended than the Obama inauguration. And we see in the middle there, those big white tarps are put down in the middle of the National Mall. If you've never been to the National Mall, it's a large piece of grass. It's like a big, giant yard that people can gather on in the event of like big national events. You see those large white tarps covering kind of the middle there, basically to protect the grass, and that's a very common thing to do. And they absolutely were there on the Obama image on the right as well, but there were people standing on them. You'll note during the Trump inauguration that there are certainly still a lot of people, but definitely less people. And that is, it's an illustration of one versus another. Tying into this concept, there were also accusations of heavy news fatigue occurring during the Trump administration, where there was just event after event after event, each one of them in previous political times would have been major scandals, but because they kept happening and happening and happening, this event eventually wore down the American public. That's another relatively interesting phenomena of that era as well. Okay, that is it for this lecture. If you have anything you need to ask me about or whatever, just send me an email.